Alright, since nothing else came out this week that I really give a shit about, at least yet, I figured we would go ahead and do this whole revisitation of Guillermo del Toro's Hellboy before going into Neil Marshall's new one with David Harbour, which I know is... It's not like the new one needs anything else against it at this point, and that this is not going to help in any way whatsoever, revisiting these so soon prior to seeing the new one, but... Yeah, but still, I figure it's also worth talking about because typically I like to go into it and, like, have it known exactly how I feel about the other variations of something before we go into a new version of it. And this is usually the easiest way to do that. I was initially just going to do Hellboy and Hellboy 2 as, like, a versus together or something, but since I needed something else for this video because I don't really care about anything else that came out, this seemed like the way to go. So, before we get into the new one, I do want to start with these two, just sort of like probably one at a time. So to talk about the first movie from 2004 first. The interesting thing about this is that, I mean, we're already like really hyped because we've already number one, Guillermo del Toro and comic book movie just seem to go together just absolutely perfectly, just in concept alone. And this is 2 years off of Blade 2, I think. And of course Blade 2 was amazing, so I think we'll be talking about that trilogy relatively soon also. But here, it's sort of this meshing of, yeah, Blade 2 had, like, you know, the vampires and all that, and they had the really cool designs and all that, but this is, like, it's a sort of superhero movie, but it's also very much at heart a monster movie at the same time. And the fact that this also went along with Mike Mignola's source material. And the interesting thing about that, especially if you look at like the 2.5-hour documentary that's on this DVD among other things, the fact that there was like such a trust between the two of them that was apparent, because obviously when you're adapting, you know, comic books or graphic novels or whatever into movies, you're gonna really hope that they stick to that source material to a certain extent. But the thing is that Mignola basically went into it telling Del Toro, obviously it's my thing, but I want you to do your thing with it. Where it's like, I think Del Toro described it as wanting to do like a jazz riff on the comics, but the whole thing was, and the fact that they kind of come together in this really perfect way, because we know that Del Toro has had this lifelong love with monsters and monster movies and all that, and creating them in different ways. Even made a monster love story that got him, you know, 2 Oscars. But there's also Mignola coming from this area where that's basically what he did. Like, this came to be because all he really, you know, could do was just draw monsters, and eventually this just kind of made itself. And the fact that these two minds are coming together to create this movie, and the original creator is giving the director his freedom to kind of make his movie, make a Del Toro movie just out of his thing. And that trust really does come through and is really apparent as it goes on. Where he even said, like, you know, make the changes that you want to make. And so Del Toro ran with that. And what we have here is a surprisingly, like, human story and human character, despite where he comes from and what exactly he is. And we do get his backstory at the start, with starting with the Nazi scene, which, of course, we're still kind of early in the comic book movie phase, at least in this era, because this was only 4 years after the first X-Men. So this opening scene, it might seem a bit, you know, redundant and familiar to start your comic book movie with Nazis. As weird as that is, it's a common thing. But immediately, any sort of vibe you might get from that is just going to be immediately gone. Because, yeah, X-Men did its thing, but Del Toro's massive vision is, like, almost immediate. Like, as soon as it starts, we see just how... because Del Toro is one of those minds that is just endlessly creative, and anytime he comes out with a new project, it's just like, you just have no idea. You can only imagine what kind of shit is gonna that he can come up with to make this as big and grand as it can possibly be. And dreamlike, nightmarish, whatever, comic book-like, just anything, he will make it come to life in some way or another. And a lot of time with effects that are as practical as possible, obviously, when you have a movie this big and this effects heavy, you're not going to be able to escape CGI entirely. And there are some scenes that are obviously going to really rely on it, but for a lot of the time, it's one of those cases where the CGI is like so skillfully done you can't always tell when it's there, or there might be something that's practical that you think is CGI but it's actually not. Um, and so for a lot of that, you have like the practical effects with the CGI only kind of sort of helping it along, and sort of like touching up what's actually practical. One thing that I know blows a lot of people's minds is the creature, whose name I've forgotten, that has the tentacles that they summon. A lot of people think a lot of that creature is CGI, when, like, everything down to, like, the last detail of the eyes and, like, all the tentacles are, like, all practical, and it's, like, a dude in a suit. And it's like, when you watch the special features on this and see, like, the making of those scenes, it's, like, unbelievable how well they pull it off and how much on camera that just completely goes by you, that could just be a dude in a practical suit, and all the tentacles and the eyes and all that have actually been constructed for real. Um, so going into that, there's so much that this has to offer, but like I was talking about, the human side of it is kind of what really makes it stand out in an interesting way, and just how much they go into it. Because in a lot of these cases, they like kind of add the human element almost as like a requirement, where it's like, oh well, we've got to get them to care in some way. So yeah, this character has this particular characteristic, or whatever. But no, there's like entire subplots devoted to just how human the characters are in this, particularly Hellboy and his feelings towards Selma Blair, who are the perfect couple, of course, because they both don't really like what they are and they feel like outcasts. But the thing is she's an outcast because she just bursts into flames, whether she likes it or not. But even though he looks like what he looks like, he also happens to be fireproof, among many other things, but that's the thing that kind of makes them come together in this really nice way. It's like what they're able to do as far as being these, mutant creatures or whatever, happens to be romantic in a sense, and the fact that these two would come together. So, when you go into this beginning, though, I know I'm all over the place, but, bear with me. This opening scene, when, like, baby Hellboy is introduced for the first time, it is one of those movies that has, like, a lot going on. So, it's at the same time, it's like there'll be some scenes that are, like, blatant exposition, especially in this opening. But this is one of those movies where it's kind of hard to complain about it, because if they didn't have that exposition, smooth or unsmooth as it is, we'd probably be totally lost. Especially if we're not familiar with the source material, which I probably should have opened with this. I am not at all. So the only thing I know about the source material is what I've heard from Mignola in interviews, or Del Toro talking about what some of his inspirations were and all that. So so if anything like that kind of gets by me, that's the reason why I'm not familiar with the source material at all. So talking about this also, they do manage to, like, when you see, these cliches of, like, exposition or them maybe over-explaining things to a certain extent, I do like that sometimes you can see them having fun with it also. Like, the instance where we have the cliche where we see a location and then the text has to come up on the screen to say what that location is. And it's when we're introduced to BPRD for the first time, and it's a transition of Jeffrey Tambor on the news saying, there is no such thing, that doesn't exist whatsoever. So when we see the transition, it's not just the normal moment of seeing a location and then the white text saying what it is, but it's like the punchline to that Jeffrey Tambor scene in the next moment also. So I like that they were able to sort of play with that a little bit, even if it's the stuff that we have seen so many times that we're bored with to this extent. To make it a punchline works even better. And obviously the movie does have, like, a really nice sense of humor about itself. Not just with the Hellboy character and the way he sees everything around him and, his, one-liners or his dialogue or whatever. But also stuff like, some stuff is maybe, like, a tad on the nose but still kind of humorous, like the use of Red Right Hand. Makes perfect sense in context. There's the whole thing where this beat Logan to the punch on the comics actually exist in this world thing, and are depicting the hero in the wrong way or the inaccurate way or whatever. So stuff like that does make it feel like, despite still being a Del Toro movie, and despite being surprisingly violent in some instances, like when you see the advertising or hear the advertising for the new one, it's sort of like you sort of expect this to almost be like a kids movie version of it, but no, there's still like some pretty gruesome stuff in this. Particularly the stuff like Clay's stabbing is like surprisingly brutal. The whole presence of Cronin here, which is really nice also because not only is he just this really great badass assassin villain, but the idea that both Del Toro and Manuel seem to like agree that in the source material apparently Cronin was just kind of there, like he didn't really do a whole lot. Just kind of his presence was known. But he took it and basically made it like a full-on Del Toro character, and then just went and made this really, violent, memorable villain out of it. So that's really appreciated, especially. Because the villains in these movies aren't exactly their strength, which is really interesting and different coming from a comic book movie, or superhero movie or whatever. So that sounds like a weird compliment to say that their villains aren't particularly strong, but that somehow, interestingly enough, makes it fresh and makes sure that its hero is absolutely front and center, which he absolutely does. And obviously, so much of that is owed to the brilliance of Ron Perlman here, who obviously has a lot of experience already, being under a shitload of makeup and all that. But still, I'm kind of reminded, maybe not to the same extent, but I'm reminded of the stuff I was saying about Jim Carrey and The Grinch, about how it's incredible what he is able to do and accomplish with his face underneath that much makeup, and how expressive it can be. And it's a compliment not just to the makeup in general, but what Perlman's able to do with it, and how even underneath all that, he's still able to do like these really nuanced expressions that really say so much about the character, and makes him, in certain ways, what we wouldn't expect when we first see him, which is the whole point of the character, that he's more than just what he looks like on here. And the fact that there's also something personal about it when you hear Mignola talk about how Hellboy is basically based on his father, and how that whole thing where, like, he basically he looks like that, and he just wants to believe that he's just another regular person walking around. It's the whole point of, like, filing down the horns and all that. But like the scene when after he's kicked somebody's ass at some point, he walks by that bench and like uses his tail to take the pack of beer that's there, and how that was basically stuff like that was basically comes from like watching his dad come home after a day of work and then just like take beer and watch TV and all that, and it's. Yeah, so it feels like there's sort of a kind of a loving sense to the existence of Hellboy also there, not to mention just the emotion the character brings out on his own in general throughout the story. And yeah, on top of that, you also have, I was talking about this love story with Selma Blair that actually plays up, in some instances, like it is like right out of a romantic comedy. Like there's the whole thing, I mean, there's the whole Myers character, which apparently was added as to basically just be like a surrogate, a surrogate for the audience, which does make sense. But then we're able to get scenes where like he's eavesdropping on them and all that, and it's like somehow the character has been established at this point this much where he's just trying to be a regular person and all that it doesn't seem out of place in this big, elaborate monster movie, when we kind of stop it for a second to get this love story where it's him almost being childish to a sense, where he's like eavesdropping on them and trying to figure out if she likes him more than him and stuff like that. So that's really charming in how it's executed also. And then there's also basically what I was talking about with shit, what was I going to say now? Oh yes, the John Hurt character also. This kind of goes in with not just the how human the characters are and where they come from, but also the way the violence is depicted. Because I was talking about there's the harshness of, like, Clay getting stabbed and whatever. But there's also this scene where John Hurt's character is killed. And obviously it's done differently. Because while it is brutal, while it is like a stabbing to the neck, you'll notice because the movie almost has like a sensitivity towards that character, and there's like this sort of respect in his death, that the shot is like from a distance and out of focus, so it's not like in your face about it, but it still hits just as hard because we know where the character comes from and how much Hellboy cares about him and the other way around. So the way it handles all of that and sometimes even meshes them together, I think is what makes the movie work so much. Because obviously it is eventually going to be, you know, a big giant effects movie, especially when we get towards the end. Um, but still, the charm never really leaves it, and the action is executed well enough, the effects are executed well enough, because it's a Del Toro movie, of course, that it all still works anyway, even when it goes... Because obviously a lot of movies like this will sacrifice all that stuff they've built up when we just get to the big explosive climax or whatever. But it's all kind of still in there, especially with the whole... he has to, you know, find his true self in order to get to this point, and then his relationship with Selma Blair is what brings her back, basically, and it's all... Yeah, so it all comes together nicely without feeling like it's going in too many directions, and with everything that it had to stuff in here, it's kind of amazing how well it worked out, and how, you know, cohesive it feels, and how everything is... Yeah, just in all the right places. So, that's pretty much how I feel about that. It is a movie that I didn't really care for when it first came out, probably because I was still like 13 or 14, and it's like, it's a movie that you really do have to keep up with because there's so much going on also, but it is one of those movies that you just kind of end up going back to, like, it just kind of like a magnet, just sort of you keep getting attracted to it even if it's not necessarily your thing. But then, you know, the more times you see it, the more it does grow on me, and the more I really appreciate some of those smaller aspects of it. Like I said, especially the effects and, you know, the practicality of a lot of them, and the whole, talking about the makeup also, I think 4 hours of makeup that Ron Perlman had to do, and the fact that they were, like, worried about how, obviously Perlman was going to be able to do it, and do those nuanced things, but they were worried as far as the makeup itself, like, if it was going to hinder anything, like, if the horns were too big and they were going to, like, hinder his eye movement, but no, it all looks fantastic. Oh, and of course I didn't even mention our big Del Toro regular, Doug Jones, doing Abe Sapien, one of his more memorable characters. Not saying a lot, because Doug Jones has a million characters, and his most notable are usually with Del Toro. And here we got David Hyde Pierce doing his voice, despite the fact that it is his own voice in the second movie. But yeah, so everything to love about Del Toro, whether it be the effects, the monsters, the humanity in them, the presence of Ron Perlman and Doug Jones, it's all in here in this big, glorious package. So, yeah, over time, that's how I've come to feel about this movie. So, we can go on to the second one now, since I just brought it up. As far as the second movie goes, the really interesting approach you have to take here is... Typically, when you do the sequel, especially to a big movie, your big plan is to go even bigger and even better and all that. But it's like, how do you really go bigger than a movie like Hellboy? But sure enough, Del Toro does seem to find a way. Even if it's... I know it's arguable whether it, you know, matches the original quality or not, but here, just as it starts off immediately... where we do get to see Hellboy young again, even though older than when we first saw him. But being told this story where we saw all those creatures and all those monsters in the first movie, and this story just immediately in the opening scene just bringing us, like, all new creatures and origins and setting up this whole other story that's going to be the plot of this one. And just immediately throwing us into, like, these new different designs and all these monsters, and that's appealing just right away. And then, obviously, after the tragedy of his character's death, it's just kind of nice seeing John Hurt again at the beginning of this one also, as he tells this story, so I thought that was a really nice touch. And then introduces us to our new villain, who is played by Luke Goss, which is interesting because it's like, when Del Toro does a sequel, this is basically his go-to actor for a villain, apparently, because he also played Nomak, the villain in Blade 2. And you can see why he cast him more than once as a villain, because he just works so well. In these particular scenes, we're not. I mean, you could obviously find some similarities because he's like the guy who's down here, and then he has the father that he kills, and then becomes like the big villain and wants to annihilate everything and all that. But also this scene early on, where we basically get to see him kill an entire room. Just does so much to set up just how much of a threat this dude is. And this is just one dude. There's a whole bunch of other shit that they're going up against in this. That's just one thing. Even if he is kind of the driving force for all that still. So the thing about this is, after we've set all that up, we do get more into the whole Selma Blair relationship, and we learn early on the fact that she's pregnant now. And I like the way that they handled that, because it's like, she kind of somewhat sets it up vaguely, but she's trying to keep it from him, and it's like, we can kind of figure out what it is, but before we think they're going to drag it out the whole movie, Abe Sapien figures it out immediately and just drops it on us in the audience, and then it becomes sort of that whole keeping a secret thing, which the interesting thing about this is that you look at how much they've built this sequel, and obviously you're going to have, bigger fights, you're going to have more CGI, you're going to have sillier comedy, but when it comes to this, you're also going to have more of the love story, and not just that, but maybe more than one love story. With another one being with an unexpected character. But the thing is like, with all this going on, the whole, like I said, like a romantic comedy plot, like the first movie, where it's like, they have to keep that secret from him, really shouldn't work in a movie like this. And the miracle of this movie is that it somehow does. And it somehow keeps that charm that this story had, between the two of them from the first movie, without it really losing any steam, and the way that we're seeing the relationship kind of progress. Like I said, there is just no way this should work in a movie like this. But here we are. And as I said, when I was talking about before about how Doug Jones is now doing his own voice for Abe Sapien as opposed to David Hyde Pierce, which is a really interesting way to go, and I don't know if this was the intention, because their voices really aren't that dissimilar. But the fact that Abe's storyline is kind of much more apparent in this one, and he has like much more to do and much more significance, and we get more into him like personally. If that has anything to do with that, and the fact that there's kind of that personal connection now, because we know that it's Doug Jones's voice as well as his body, and that sort of disconnect of one body and one voice isn't there anymore. So I like the way that turned out. And there's also, talking about new characters, the inspired inclusion of Seth MacFarlane's voice over Krause, this dude that's now overlooking Hellboy and making sure that he doesn't go overboard. So as we go into this, I was talking about the fact that we're introduced to a lot of new creatures. And once again, I was talking about in the first movie about how, with this new movie trying to throw around how R-rated and bloody it is, you kind of forget how not all that downplayed these movies are in regards to that. Sometimes there's horrifying shit in these movies, particularly this one, starting with the tooth fairies. Because there's that whole thing, and then also though, while there are moments where the monsters seem horrifying like that, where they eat the dude down to his bones, many people that is. We also have the monsters like the forest god, where we can, number one, it's interesting because we can see like sort of, it almost feels like an early stage of Pacific Rim, like 5 years prior to the fact. But there's also the scenes that follow this, where we do have, the big, CGI fights and the big monsters and all the designs and all that, which are great. But they're even better when they're followed up with scenes like the scene that, where this forest god scene ends, where they bring him down, and there's the whole interaction where Lugos is telling him, like, it's the last of his kind, and there's the whole thing where, like, and this is at the time where, like, the public hates him and all that, and there's like this debate that we see in him, but then when he finally does it, it seems like this big moment where he might be going against something, depending on how well you buy what the prince is saying. where it kind of, the city just turns into that forest, and it's this really, really beautiful scene following this, gigantic action scene, and you really don't see movies, especially movies this big, take that approach to their scenes that are super big. Like, can you imagine, like, Michael Bay movies having the sort of decency to have, their big action scenes and then follow them up with a scene like this? It would be crazy. And to see it here is just fantastic, but at the same time, like, just feels like totally Del Toro's approach. Where you've got everything that's really big and monster-like, and you've also got the sensitivity to it. It's just like this perfect balance that perfectly shows off just the way he's executing these movies in general, which I really like. And then, yeah, there's also the fame subplot, where we had the first movie, Hellboy, to the public was basically like UFO footage or Bigfoot footage of the Loch Ness Monster or something, where it's like all the footage of him was blurry for some reason. And then this is the first time he's kind of like really, really revealed to the public, and they really get a good look at him, and he gets to basically go in and interact now in the city without having to worry about being this hidden creature. And it's pretty, he gets a pretty underwhelming welcome from them, where it's like, for a second, it's like, oh, it's Hellboy, holy shit. It's the mythical creature that's actually alive. And then it just turns into people shouting at him that he's ugly, and that's all they really care about anymore. Which makes sense also, not just from this comedic standpoint, or for Hellboy's character, just another thing he has to go through, but the fact that the Prince's whole plot is basically that, because humanity has gotten to where it is why he's doing what he's doing. So all that ties together nicely, because it's also another thing where it just feels timed well, because it's like, it seems like something that probably could have happened in the first movie, where he's revealed to the public and all that. But it just sort of feels like, timed well enough here, where it's something that can carry over from the first movie, and we can expand on that without it feeling like we're just sort of grasping for ideas. It feels like this was kind of the time to do that, so I like the way they handled that and didn't put, all their eggs in one basket in the first movie, and we're able to sort of, it feels very much intentional how stretched out across these two movies this whole storyline is, which really plays up the idea of how much people are disappointed that we got this new one with Neil Marshall as opposed to Del Toro's third one, which we didn't get because Del Toro didn't get the budget that he wanted, and knew that if he tried to do it any other way, it probably wouldn't work, and we wouldn't get his full vision, so we just have to deal with these two. But these two still feel like enough of a, nice, coherent story, though it does feel like there's like one more jumping off point we could have done, and seen like what his big finale would have been, but still, it never pains me too much. The main thing that really kind of pains me is thinking about where, like, Del Toro and Perlman are coming from, where it's, like, how much passion they had in this. And you could sense, I saw an interview with Ron Perlman where they were asking him about the new one, and he was being respectful, but you could tell, like, how badly he wanted it, and how much it was kind of eating away at him, that they just took this other approach with another actor and all that. And it's something you can totally understand also, and really kind of adds to the humanity. Seeing this reaction to us not getting the third movie in this lineup just adds more to the humanity and shows how much love and how much of their energy was put into these two. And how much that comes off on the screen also, just clearly how much of a labor of love this was from everybody. And that's really where these movies kind of stand out, not just on their, the merits of their effects and all that, which are obviously what they are, but still, so many things just make this feel like something totally different for what we see like it, and just makes everything else that is like it seem much less, I don't want to say like entirely soulless, because I don't have a specific example in mind, but you feel like you don't really see stuff like this when you watch these movies. Like, they feel like their own thing, even though there are probably many things you can sort of, point to that might, seem like they were inspired by them or whatever. Like obviously there's the whole, love of old monster movies that Del Toro has, and the way he's able to incorporate those in his movies. Like some of the instances we saw in The Shape of Water, but here most notably, the scene where he and Selma Blair are kind of at odds, and this scene is capped off with TV off to the side playing the end of Bride of Frankenstein. When they both, the scene where Frankenstein's monster comes to the conclusion that he and the bride are not meant to be what they are. They are basically not meant to exist because of what they are. And this like I said, it almost would seem like on the nose under another director's vision, but here it just kind of is like that perfect little punctuation to the scene and the moment. So I love the way he's able to pull that stuff off. But like I said, it is going to get bigger. Like I said, the CGI is going to get bigger. The comedy is going to get maybe a bit sillier. Like, they're really going to kind of go in for the slapstick here. Particularly this scene with Krause in the lockers. Or when Hellboy's approaching a confrontation while drunk. But like I said, there's also that lightness to it. Even though it's able to do scary shit like the Tooth Fairies, it's also able to do some of the lighter stuff, like when they're when he and Abe Sapien sing together. And that's one of those cases where in another movie I'd probably get on its case for just like using a song as a crutch for an entire scene or an entire storyline, really. But there's just something so perfect and unexpected about the two of them getting drunk and singing this song together, and the way that it comes back later also just really does work. And overall, like talking about the production design just kind of looks brighter also, particularly in like the final fight scene where everything just looks like bright and gold and all that, and it's still like aesthetically it feels so different from the first movie, but still has the same effect. And in that sense, I really like just the way it comes off the screen like that. And we've got a Danny Elfman score now. We had it was Marco Beltrami in the first movie, and yeah, so all of this stuff really comes together in a really great way, much like I was talking about with the first movie. And as far as these two go, I think for me personally, Hellboy 2 might have like a bigger rewatchability factor. But with the way it's able to touch on the things that it does and the way that it does, I would say, I mean, clearly, obviously, because we wouldn't even have this without it, but that the first movie is kind of more of an accomplishment. But still, the way he's able to balance all that stuff between these two movies is amazing. And like I said, feel like it's something that we haven't seen before or since, but we've seen people try. We've certainly seen people try, and we're about to talk. And not in this genre in general, I mean, not even with the Hellboy character, but yes, we are about to talk about that. So I think that's all I have to say about these two. So I guess we'll talk about this. We've actually already brought it up a couple of times before even going into this, but I guess the first thing worth talking about with this new one is the whole R-rated thing. So I understand when the whole obviously we had Deadpool happen, and then between two Deadpool movies we had Logan, and studios saw this and were like, oh, we could really cash in on this whole R-rated superhero movie comic book thing. But you've also got to be like, I think it was James Gunn that actually came out and said shortly after Deadpool came out, was if you're gonna like cash in on all this, you got to be really careful with it and make sure you're doing it in the right way. But basically, we foresaw disaster and how other studios were going to treat this sort of thing. Because I felt like the Deadpool thing got old pretty fast, and every now and then, I felt like Mangold was maybe trying a little too hard in regards to making Logan as R-rated as possible. But none of that has come to the extent of what this is. This is like, this new Hellboy by Neil Marshall is like the absolute embodiment of trying way too hard to do all that. I think it got to the point to where they were really building up how bloody it was going to be, and how they were just going to go as hard R-rated as possible, basically trying to get that 12 to 13-year-old demographic excited. And it got to the point where when they finally got their MPAA rating, and the reason for it, I heard that they like actually plastered it all over their trailers. And it got like really sort of embarrassing how much they were using this as a crutch, how obvious it was that this is the only thing they had to like really, really market this thing. So, I mean, you do have an appealing actor like David Harbour taking over, I know a lot of people were still really upset and bitter about it not being Perlman, which I totally get. But Harbor seemed like a choice where it was like, sort of immediately when you hear that, it's like, I can see it. And it's like, maybe if Perlman had gotten to do the full trilogy, then Harbor did another movie, people wouldn't have given Harbor the stink eye as much as they did at the start. And obviously he's a really great actor. I get a bit elitist when it comes to David Harbour, because it's like, I knew who he was, like, you know, over a decade before Stranger Things even happened. So I'm one of those people in the back saying, I knew David Harbour before it was cool. But the thing here, though, is that when it starts immediately, you just kind of get that sense of the whole trying too hard thing. And they're going to use the R rating as much as they possibly can from the very beginning to the very end. When the very opening line is, we fade in and we get the whole, you know, gray tint so that we know this is some flashback and we're getting some backstory on Mia Jovovich's character. And one of the lines, the first lines the narrator says is, this time was called the Dark Ages for fucking good reason. And it's like, just to have that as one of the very early lines is like the thing that, when I talked about Logan having some of those moments, was the fact that when they released the first page of the script and Mangold went on that whole thing about how this is going to be real, people are going to die, it's not going to be some CGI fuckathon or whatever, and literally the very first line of dialogue is just Logan saying the word fuck. And it just felt like really, yeah, just like, I know it's kind of an overused criticism, but yeah, there's people that say it basically felt like it was made by teenagers for teenagers, and by teenagers we mean like the really, really early ones, like 13 to 15. So once we get past that, and we get this backstory on Mia Jovovich, and it does go into the movie, I was a little impressed with something, and that was, oh, they actually skipped over the origin story. They know we know that story, they know we don't have to see it, so the movie just gets right on its way. And he goes to a luchador wrestling event and fights a winged vampire that used to be like his partner or work with him. Interesting location for the first big scene of your movie, but okay. We'll go with it, because we're still at the beginning, and we want to be on board as long as we possibly can. But the thing is the thing that kind of got me on board was, oh, we're skipping Hellboy's origin story again. It wants to get right to it. Okay. I spoke too soon. This movie has a lot of flashbacks in it. Probably 3 or 4, at least, they're like full scenes by themselves. So we go back and we get Hellboy's backstory all over again. We get a look at Rasputin again, all that. The only real purpose that this scene serves, because we know exactly what it is, it almost looks even like almost the same sets as Del Toro, only obviously not near as elaborate or good. But we do get the appearance of Lobster Johnson, played by Thomas Hayden Church. Once again, not familiar with the source material at all, but I had heard that this character was like a fan favorite, and of course I love everything Thomas Hayden Church does. So this seemed like a good combination. And then like he makes the most of that 30 or so seconds. But then, of course, we're just on our way. And another problem that this causes is that not only is it just, we really didn't need to see the backstory again, and it feels like the movie's slowing down because it wants to tell us so much we already know, when we're already in the middle of a plot. But on top of the showing us this character in like this real badass scene of him just shooting people left and right and being his cool self, and then it's like, this is the movie that you want, isn't it? Well, this is like the only scene this guy's in, pretty much. Goodbye. And that in itself pretty much says everything about the movie. The other thing that pretty much says everything about this movie is a scene towards the end when Mia Jovovich is there with her pig monster, played by Stephen Graham from Snatch and Boardwalk Empire. And as they're going through the city, we get a cut of Ian McShane, and Ian McShane is basically just nonchalantly saying, alright, we've got a sorcerer and her pig monster, and they're coming for us. And it's like, the fact that you can basically describe the plot of the movie like that, I think says a lot, including the nonchalant way that he did. So yeah, and that's another thing too, is the warmth of the other movies is clearly going to be missing here because they're so hardcore. That's the thing they're going for. So we're not going to get the warmth that John Hurt had from this Ian McShane character now that is supposedly the same character. But still, we do have his character, the Hellboy character, trying to do the thing where he is like the sort of likable asshole type, but he's also kind of like really bitchy. And I've heard arguments. I don't, as somebody that doesn't know the source material, I don't fucking know what it's supposed to be because I've heard so many different things. I've heard a lot of people say, "Oh, Del Toro got it just right. That's absolutely perfect." But then there's the other side saying like they were really building up that Mignola had a lot to do with the production of this movie and was like there and overseeing it and everything. And it's like, oh, this movie's doing, you know, these little certain things that Del Toro's movies didn't touch on, or Del Toro's movies were too light, or whatever. And it just, I've heard so many back and forth things. I do not know what the fuck the source material is like. But in regards to how I saw it, not knowing any of that, I felt like the whole angle of like the relationships between the characters and the humanity in them is so incredibly missing from this and really takes a big chunk out of it. Like we were just talking about how much that adds to the movies and how that's what really made them feel different. On top of the times, it was this, you know, wonderful concoction of all those things. But you can't really have a wonderful concoction when you've only got a lot of one thing and none of the other thing. And especially when that other thing really it's like such a contrast that there's such a perfect balance here. But this movie's not interested in that. This movie's interested in being R-rated and gory. So that's what they're gonna do. So as far as the Hellboy character, we do have moments where, like, the opening scene when they're in the wrestling ring, the way he's kind of trying to talk the other guy down, talking about his music, or the scene in the kitchen with Sasha Lane where, like, for a split second he thinks he's about to get shot in the balls, and we just see, like, the panic and the relief wash over him at the same time. And scenes like that, you can kind of see where David Harbour would really work with this character. Even if those scenes themselves aren't perfect, you can see it in there. You can see, like, okay, in another universe, this movie would work, and this performance would definitely work. But it's unfortunately in the movie that it's in. And then we get and sometimes it doesn't work at all. Like when we get scenes when he turns into the, you remember, Dude, Where's My Car, when they go through the drive-thru and there's the woman that only says "and then" through the intercom? Hellboy basically plays her for about 30 seconds for no damn reason. So that scene's in there for whatever purpose it serves. And every now and then there's an interesting visual. They're rare, but they're in there. Like when Mia Jovovich first enters the scene and we see like her really long red dress while everything else is like, you know, has the gray look about it. Sort of brings back the memory of, in the first movie when they resurrect Rasputin and you've got, like, the red on the white snow that looked really awesome as he rose out of it. It kind of somewhat reminds you of that, but that's the thing, is when this movie's in its best moments, it's basically because you're saying, that kind of reminds me of what Del Toro did a little bit. So, take that for what you will. Because for the most part, as far as dialogue goes, it's one of those movies where everything is exposition. Everything is somebody telling us their life story, whether we need it or not. Those flashbacks keep happening. There's a point in time when, very late in the movie, we get the backstory of Daniel Day-Kim's character. And the thing about this is that this comes so late in the movie, and the way that it's shown after we've had so many flashbacks already, is it feels like it's, you know, making fun of itself. It feels like parody. When we hear the music grow and we know we're about to go back into flashback. It took me a second to realize if that was supposed to be funny or not, that we were getting this guy's backstory so late in the movie after getting all the backstories already. And I don't think it is. I think it's actually playing it straight, which is its big problem here. And it's weird to see a movie fail so hard trying to play it straight when we've got scenes like Hellboy after he's like drunk at a bar and they come and get him for his big assignment and he's like, "How did you find me?" And the response is Twitter. I guess to their credit that's the only time Twitter is mentioned in this movie, but at the same time you can tell it's just in there to say, oh, this is Hellboy now in 2019, and this is topical. I don't fucking know. Because we also got him dealing with new technology, like the shot you can see coming from a mile away where he's got the phone laid out and he's talking to Ian McShane, and when he goes to press it, oh, he goes to press it with his right hand, so he crushes it, and he does that again later. Of course, after saying the line, I've got a real gentle touch. But it's like, after he says that, you're like, dude, we saw this punchline coming from a mile away. Just crush your phone, please. And it's like, just as expected, every single beat gets us there. And then there's dialogue that's just so, like, what is the point of all of this? Because we got the whole thing where the guys hire him to go kill giants. So he walks in this room like Ace Ventura and looks at all the head trophies and all that. And he's looking around and he says, so it looks like you guys are pros at killing giants. Why do you need my help killing 3 giants when you've got this whole room full of trophies? Fast forward about 10 minutes, and the giants are here. Before the giants are here, those guys, you know, like, turn on him, and they stab him, and they throw him in the river or whatever, and they say, haha, did you really think we needed your help getting giants? Because we've killed so many. And it's like, no, I'm gonna be honest with you, I don't think he ever thought that, because he straight up fucking told you you didn't need his help because you had trophies everywhere. But that is a line of dialogue. Them saying after he said that, did you really think we needed your help? No, he didn't think that. He came along because the plot needed him to. Because he needed to get to where you could stab him and throw him in the river. Even though he's gonna be perfectly fine. And he can still fight off the 3 giants after this has happened and the giants have killed all of you dumb fucks. But, yeah, so that's a whole scene wasted. That's, like, still in this very long first half hour. That's another thing, too. Is, when you watch Del Toro's movies, the pacing is so incredibly fast. Like, it feels like the movie's barely started when they're reaching their half-hour mark. When this movie reaches its half-hour mark, like, a whole half of a movie has already happened. The whole movie Jack the Giant Slayer has already happened in the first half hour of this movie. So that's what you have to look forward to with that. And then, as it goes on, like I said, every now and then, there's, like the Baba Yaga character is kind of freaky, and there's the image of, like, every now and then the imagery, like I said, pops up. There's the walking house thing, which I still can't decide if that's weird and interesting or stupid. It's find some beautiful middle ground between those two, I guess. But then, obviously, the gore really starts to kick in the later half. And it's, you know, people being ripped to pieces and decapitations everywhere. This movie will make you bored of seeing decapitations. This is how they're using their R rating. And, of course, the violence isn't even that, you know, spectacular. It's really, like, obvious CGI and all that. Even, like, the really over-the-top gross stuff, like a guy getting his face ripped off, just looks like really poor quality CGI. Like, below video game level, even. It's really not that impressive at all. And it's like, it would be, honestly, kind of disturbing if it didn't look so fake, because it's this whole thing. I think it's trying to play with the idea of superhero movies where we see the climaxes and there's, like, mass damage, and the audience kind of come out nitpicking and saying, like, can you imagine the innocent lives that must have been in that carnage? So we actually get to see up close and personal the innocent people just being ripped to pieces and blood splattering on the camera and all that. And you just don't really feel anything, because the movie hasn't really made you feel anything up to this point, and like I said, it just looks so fucking fake when it finally gets there anyway. There's nothing here. There's nothing here of worth, really. So, the rest of the end of the movie was basically just me. Like, the entire last half hour, 45 minutes or so, was me desperately trying to not zone out. But I'm probably a little more forgiving of the movie than all of this sounds, because I think I had the great fortune of knowing about the response before I went in. And it's like how it's being built up as, like, the worst thing ever, and it's a comparison that I actually was thinking of as I went in. Because I know people are saying, like, oh, it's on the level of Josh Trank's Fantastic Four or whatever. I think this movie is very easy, which is really funny because this movie is only PG-13 and barely has any blood in it. But this is the first thing and one of the only things I was like, this is the movie I'm thinking of when I watched this new Hellboy. I was getting a lot of Jonah Hex watching it. So depending on how you feel about that, might say how you feel about this. And the gore and them going after that R rating has pretty much nothing to do with it. So that was just a waste in general, but yeah. But with that in mind, what I was saying was, I had all these sort of expectations of this would be one of the worst movies in the history of movies. Of course I know better because I've probably seen the worst of the worst, and they're very far away from this. But yeah, it's if you go in and you think it's going to be the worst thing ever, it might not seem that bad. Where, like, there are certainly bad things about it, like the dialogue and a lot of the effects, and the story's kind of all over the place and not very interesting, and they're trying too hard with the gore and all that. But it's really just sort of there. Like, I did find myself saying, you know, on more than one occasion, like, that's interesting that they would do that, and that seems like it's open to being something that could have been, you know, cool in another movie or whatever. And then there's like the 30 seconds of Thomas Hayden Church and all that. Honestly, the best scene of the movie is probably the mid-credit scene, if that says anything. So, but apart from that, yeah. So like, I don't like have an overwhelming hatred for this. I just don't really care about it. But there are some things in there where it's like, alright, there was something here, and you could tell somebody probably worked hard on that aspect or whatever. And like I said, David Harbour, while there are a lot of cases where it's like, you can just see the character sort of tripping over itself, there are definitely moments where you're like, he obviously could work. It's like, even just in the news of his casting, it's like, that could work. Even if the movie sucks and the movie doesn't let him do it to his fullest, there is another universe where David Harbour is a perfect Hellboy, even if he's not Ron Perlman. So, so yeah, I'm just sort of indifferent to this, even though there is a lot to complain about. I just don't have like any sort of passionate hatred for it. Like I said, I've probably seen much worse. That's probably the reason. So obviously, people who only see a certain amount of movies a year will probably think this is one of the worst things ever, but it's probably not. It's really probably not. But once again, though, thinking about Del Toro's movies and going back to them right before you go to this, not doing it any favors whatsoever. That's really the many nails in its coffin, I think. So, yeah, so that's what these are. So, next week, there is The Curse of La Llorona. I don't know if I'm going to see that immediately or not, but if I don't, it'll probably just be some concoction video with a bunch of stuff I've missed on it. Hoping to track down the newest episode of The Twilight Zone before too long, and there is more Versus coming also. So, we have all that to look forward to. So, until all that, that's it for this.